You may be wondering why we call it Parlance Chamber Concerts. You're seeing why right now. Because I tend to talk a lot during these events, and I do it because I think that people like to know a little bit about the music that they'll be hearing. And so I thought I would just say a few words about this first piece on the program, because it isn't played that much, and it's slightly enigmatic, and I think it's a very great piece, this Adagio in B minor. And I was reading about it, and I turned up a quote from a great Mozart scholar who lived in the last century. His name was ALFRED EINSTEIN, and he described it as one of the most perfect, most deeply felt, and most despairing of all of Mozart's works. Which is a curious way to put it, but I think that this key of B minor, in a way, telegraphs Mozart's despair, because it's a key that he almost never used. And when he entered this into his catalog, he was specific. The piece is in B minor. And of all 660-something pieces that he wrote, only 2 movements are in B minor. This 15-minute piece and a 3-minute piece that he wrote about 10 years before in a flute quartet. So clearly it was a significant moment for him, and it's a key that Beethoven later referred to as a black key. And I called the piece enigmatic, and I think if you listen to it, you may find it a little bit enigmatic, because on the one hand, it is perfectly poised in its Mozartian balance and proportions, and on the other hand, it is rather unbalanced in its moment-to-moment drama and in its character and the way that it vacillates between the poles of mood and registration and dynamics. You'll hear at the beginning, it starts in this mood of introspective lament. And then within a very short time, it erupts into pounding, defiant gestures in the middle of the keyboard, and then there's a dialogue between the lower component of the keyboard and the upper and vacillating dynamics. And as we listen, we begin to think, what is it about? It must have some extra musical meaning, but Mozart isn't telling us what. He calls it Adagio. It's to be played slowly. There's no dedication. There's nothing in any of his letters. And it is, of course, an iffy proposition to try to ascribe specific meaning to an abstract piece of music. But some musicologists have speculated that given the fact that it is in this unusual key for Mozart, given the fact that it is in this enigmatic mood, and given the fact that his father, Leopold, had died the previous May, that there may be some element of eulogistic contemplation of his complicated relationship with his father buried in this piece. And I think that that is possible, and we remember that relationships between sons and fathers are always complicated affairs, but particularly between Mozart and his father, Leopold. His father was a very intelligent man, a very fine musician, legendarily prickly, legendarily domineering as a person. And when Mozart was about 4, his father began to realize that he had a young genius on his hands, and he felt it was his responsibility to put his own career aspirations on the shelf and to devote himself single-mindedly to the cultivation of this young genius and to the stage management of his career. And of course, early on, all that went fine, and as Mozart got older and began to pull away, his father began to want him to understand the degree to which he had sacrificed on his behalf. And so in the letters that he wrote, you have phrases like this one, "On your life depends my life." No pressure, though. And of course, Mozart as a child was completely reciprocal in his devotion, and his letters have phrases like this one, "After God comes immediately Papa." But of course that changed, and as he became an adolescent and a young man, he needed more autonomy and artistically as a man, and this inspired bitterness in his father and anger and even a degree of desperation to cling on to this once closely knit relationship. And so eventually in the early 1780s, Mozart in his early 20s decided it was time to break away from the grip of his father and move out of constricting Salzburg and go off to glittering Vienna to seek his fame and fortune, which he did. And in further defiance of his father's wishes, he married Constanze and started his own family. And this once so closely knit relationship began to fray and eventually just began to unravel entirely. And finally, in 1787 when his father died, he seems to have regarded his son as the family traitor. And we can glean that by looking between the lines of the letters that Mozart wrote to his sister in the wake of the death of his father, in which he indicates that although he was deeply in need of money at that time, his father had essentially written him out of the will. He had disinherited him for the sin of having dared to live as an independent man and artist. And so, circling back to the piece we're about to hear, I think it is possible, in light of its unusual character, its unusual key, it having been written close on the heels of the death of his father, that there is this eulogistic undercurrent in the piece. And of course, the reason that we love Mozart as much as we do is because he, among all composers, understood the intricacies of the human heart and was able to translate those into transcendent, transformative moments that still move us 200 years later. And at the very end of this piece, one of those transformative moments takes place in the last 6 bars of the piece. You'll hear it become more and more intense and tormented, and there's a sense of long chromatic moans, one after another. And finally, they just peter away, and we end in a mood of quiet, peaceful resolution, at last in the key of B major. And I think if you buy into the notion that there is this eulogistic undercurrent flowing through the piece, then that moment of resolution can be heard as this moment of filial love and understanding and perhaps transcendent forgiveness. Or I could be completely wrong about this, but anyway, it's what I think. So forgive me for going on so long about that, but I thought it was an interesting perspective on the piece. I think you'll enjoy the concert, and I'm sure you'll enjoy Peter Serkin, so please welcome him now.